when I was looking at this, I'm going to blame Prof. Mole, because yesterday's presentation meant that I actually scrapped what I was going to write about, and instead of which I engaged with a whole lot of other things instead. But I do believe that it was very important that he was quite provocative in terms of questioning the foundations of 4IR, and legitimately so. So that also got me thinking that, and some of the other presentations yesterday as well were quite similar to what I would have presented, which was more the hows rather than the whys. And I felt that therefore, in order to engage, it was important that we grapple a bit with the whys as well. The one thing we do have with science at the moment is that we break things fast. That's a norm. Your minimal viable product, Facebook. And it made me reflect that earlier my boys used to use industrial quantities of vinegar and all the rest, but were just adamant that they'd break everything. And I remember saying to my son, Connell, like, you must stop breaking things. And his response was, but mummy, how will I ever learn how things work unless you let me break them? So, and at the moment, we've got a lot of big, hairy, scary, wicked problems as a result of us breaking things. The environment, we're in the middle of the Anthropocene era. We've got fast fashions failures where the amount, that we've got the Zaras of the world just creating unbelievable mounds of waste, sort of 8% of the world's plastics and so on. Also, a disrespect for Indigenous knowledge systems. Your cool buildings of the Australian Aboriginals did lead to a lack of this build-up, and both in Norway and Australia and worldwide, we're realizing that that by not looking at what used to work before, we've ended up with other issues. And I think the University of Essex has just shown that the pyrocumulonimbus clouds are directly pretty much responsible for the massive global warming in Europe of the last year. Health, who would have thought that in the pandemic, we distrust big pharma, that they create vaccines that work and no one wants, or a proportion of people do not want to use them, do not want to adhere to the guidance. Democratic governance, we've got an information war where it's easy to hack the voter, not the vote, and the rise of alternative facts. And I think as well, the whole concept of education and joblessness. Is 4IR going to lead to more joblessness? Is it just a way, and this sense of the digital divide, and what we must do is like play catch up with the rest of the world. And is that always, if we look at context and so on, are these important? So these are big questions that we really need to deal with. And in terms of who I am, I'm a pracademic. I work between praxis and theory, and obviously there's context. So as my father always said, a week in the library can save you years in the field, and also a week in the field can save you years in the library. There's that necessary tension, but one of the most important things we need to take into account is the context. I'm an applied human scientist. My original training was at the Human Sciences Research Council. And obviously you look at the human brain and behavior, and how do you affect attitudes, emotions, beliefs, and behavior. So if we're wanting to increase STEM, if we're wanting to draw people to STEM, and so on, what are the things that we need to do? And with all of your applied human sciences, whether it's education, criminology, advertising, politics, psychology, or cognitive neurosciences, you take the human brain as brain, but brain, like not just the mind, but obviously your mind, body, how you act, how you believe, and so on. And in fact, one could very strongly argue, advertising is very much a subset of education. It's education you learn without knowing that you're learning. And Dr. Daniel Starch, who was an educational psychologist, actually created the fundamental understanding of advertising. criminology is about how do we dial down behaviors we don't like. Your education is how do we dial up. So those are the kinds of, and I've worked in most of these areas, having had a tool set that enables you to move between, because at the end of the day, humans are have certain predictabilities. And so the topics that I was asked to cover was how to teach learners to be innovative. And this is from Ms. Marabi's slide from yesterday, which I've loaded at the bottom. And does it make sense to include creativity as an aspect of STEM teaching and learning? And what I don't disagree with any of the methodologies that she was looking at, and the rest, the collaboration, your project-based learning, confidence, and so on. So, and a lot of what I was going to present was going to be very much in this model of how, the methods and so on. But I felt that therefore, since a lot of this was covered and covered by many other presenters, it was important then to engage more with the why. I also really enjoyed Ms. Olivier's slide, and again, this is our context. So the praxis was the previous slide. This here is your context, and I've added the white bit to where I've added poverty. We've got digital divides, inequality, unemployment, decision fatigue, overcrowded classrooms, which are a reality. How do we work with them? Teachers teaching out of subject, lacking confidence, poorly qualified. And we find particularly in your grade 7, where you've got the start of what should be the specialist phase, but in the built environment, we are dealing with teachers who are still within a primary school. They are teaching out of subject, and they may themselves have never come across science or anything else. And then I think in terms of the theory, I'm fully, this presentation by Prof. Ian Mole is always about emotions. There's no such thing as a mind without emotion, and we are feeling machines that think. And if we predicate that as our basis for understanding how do we apply within an educational system what we have learned, the science of education, then you have a very different approach. And your question then is like the question around, should we add creativity, is itself part of what one might philosophically talk about as a Cartesian bifurcation. Because the question itself presumes a divide. It says, oh, we've got mind versus body, man, and I'm saying, I put in inverted commas because at the time it was man versus nature, science versus art, logic versus emotion. It's divisive rather than additive, never mind multiplicative. So how do we work? And the question would be that what we do know is that humans are inherently creative, but they are easily crushed. They are so easily, you know, these bright little faces that come in grade 0, grade 1, just desperate to learn, turn into these sullen teenagers who like, ma'am, is this going to be in the exam? Is it in the exam? And I do, the German, we were funded by German based nonprofit Siemens Stiftung, and then later on a number of other German nonprofits. And the important thing for them is that collaboration is such a key part of how you understand. And one of the things, and it's just a drop in at the bottom, is that you've got the 6 C's: collaboration, communication, content, critical thinking, creative innovation, and confidence. But when we think about it, they're not like, oh, you can have 5 and not 6. Because at the end of the day, that collaboration is like the soil. It's so fundamental that if you do not have that sense of psychological safety embedded in a classroom, you could look at Seri Liu. I know that E-Cubed within the Department of Basic Education is very much focusing on how do we enable collaborative networks. And if I've put Google there to say that Google, after all of its analysis, knows that and they were surprised. They couldn't work out how they'd maybe get a whole bunch of Ivy League superstars and they'd underperform another team. And the bottom line was that at the end of the day, when they sifted through all of this and they measured everything, the only thing that stood out was that the teams that performed well had established psychological safety. Simple. And that the rest flows from there. So, I mean, I don't want to make like overly labor this, but it was all about, if your creative innovation is the flower that you're wanting, it needs to be rooted in the soil of collaboration, and it needs to have a network of communication and so on. The one thing, this is quite an astonishing, but it actually makes so much sense. And this is, when you think about it, the functional magnetic resonance imagery, they've noted that exactly the same part of the brain lights up for both ostracism and pain. And in fact, painkillers dull social rejection. So that's part of the reason why people become addicted to it, because it enables you. I mean, it's not like, oh, here we've got a mind and here we've got a body. They're so interrelated. And if there's anything we've learned in the last couple of decades, it's that social media is about this deep sense of belonging, and being socially connected is our brain's lifelong passion. So at some levels, humans are remarkably predictable and vulnerable. You know, and this is the thing, you can hack the voter because they want to believe you, they want to be part of your group, they want to have you give simple answers. I mean, it's, you know, the authoritarian route. I've got the answers, listen to me, no one else can solve it, I know exactly what to do. Humans are drawn to want to have simple answers to complex emotional issues. And I think that was, and that is why then, if we go forward on this, how fundamental it is for us that if we are going to impact a classroom, we have to work with the teachers. And we need to make sure that the teachers themselves experience a safe space, that they themselves have cooperative learning, that they themselves have, and so there's a methodological, I mean, Nomvoyo, who's our chief materials developer, was at UCT, she's there in the purple at the back. She's very clear about how if you yourself have never been in a safe space within an educational environment, how can you model it? And without that, all the rest flows. As I said, all the rest start to flow from that. And so we want, and you know, there's certain things that we can't change. We can't change overcrowded classrooms, but what we can do is give them tools with which to handle big classes. What we can do is help them with their cats, you know, that there's a level of saying, you know, ideally this should all happen here, but at another level, this is the real world and we need to engage with it. I think what I do find, I did spend quite a long time in advertising and marketing research. And as I said, Dr. Daniel Starch he's just amazing, but it's about unstructured learning. So what we can learn from advertising is, it was interesting in print advertising, for instance, you have extremely clear trends, which have to do with the neurophysiology, how the mind brain or your eye brain sees things and perceives things. So the larger something is, the more it's going to grab your attention. Simple. If it's colorful, color outperforms black and white. Obviously, if you're wanting to teach, you've got to repeat. And that's why you'll get those ads on the, you know, on the radio every morning, the same ad, because it's making sure that even though it's incidental learning, they're going to pattern it. But the things that totally outperform the trend line and then get you a huge amount of bang for your buck, think Nando's, right, are the images, your creativity, your likability, humor, and its ability to make you feel like you belong. And one of the most interesting things about advertising, whether it's print, media, TV, whatever, but is that likability is the best predictor of its performance, provided it actually hooks to the product. Sometimes things are, you like it, but you can't remember the product. So there is a step there. And that was why, for instance, you get Hillary Clinton is extremely unlikable, and Trump has charisma. Charisma is an interesting concept, but your authoritarians, your dictators have it in spades, you know. So it's something that it was drawn to. So from that perspective, we were really trying. I think it just talks to how. I mean, advertising at the end of the day knows, and the rate cards indicate exactly what works, and it's a very clear formula. But the one thing that actually just takes it out of the ballpark are your creatives. When something like lights a conversation, whatever, it's instant. It's everything lights up, and boom, you've now kind of hit it out of the ballpark. So in terms of where we were as STEAM, it's like, obviously, so bottom line is yes, of course you have to be creative. You have to embed creativity, but that also within a classroom, you need people to feel psychological safety. And so this was, and one of the things that we also decided was we considered it a box cake approach, and that's the kind of the scaffolding or the support, which kind of is up at the top in terms of confidence, but it's also, if you don't have that, how do you enable it? If you know the teachers never studied science, is having to teach science, how do you give them the supportive structures? How do you scaffold the learning? How do you make them feel confident so that they are able to then, you know, listen to questions, not feel threatened, and not, quite frankly, skip those sections of the textbooks. I didn't understand chemistry, so I just skipped that section. And I think that, so our feeling there was that we wanted to ensure that if they get the box, the materials, whatever, that they, like a box cake, you just follow the recipe and you have success. So, and obviously with the COVID pandemic, we pivoted into putting the materials onto a platform. We have found that it's really hard to model cooperative learning or collaborative learning with the limitations of the digital tools. You can do it. You can do it in a Zoom, and you have breakaway rooms and all the rest, but if the teacher on the other end is using their own data, they're in a, you know, that is something that is problematic. But on the other hand, there's also the worksheets and so on, where we looked at creating the, you know, again, giving them, this is the recipe, these are the ingredients, this is what you do. What we did was we also took the basics of your creation of heterogeneous groups, which is really important from your collaborative learning, randomization, we gamified them. We found that we've standardized. This was actually created by a French researcher, and she was looking at how to model science for children for whom English was another language, maybe not even their second or their third. And so we've standardized on these, because what we loved was that she modeled what you do and what you say. So you have a clear idea of what is the role, what do you do, what do you say. And we know that most people say, what the cooperative learning should be 4. We found 6 works fine, and we knew that these cards were a big hit when teachers started like walking off with them. So that was useful. The approach has also been about low data, low ink, and also open education resources, which I think is really critical as well. Even though people think of open education resources as necessarily digital, they're not. I mean, anything can be an open education resource. But what we found, especially working with the German materials, was that they were so color saturated, they were so intense, they were so expensive to print and so on. and also to send around that we've kind of got a very, very simple, and what we've tried obviously to do is work through the critical concept of the capsulant, and that's where working with teachers, or sorry, trainers who have many years of experience in working with teachers, they've kind of got the scaffolded approach. It's a lot of what do you do, watching them in an environment and saying, hold on a second, why are you now doing it like this? Why are you doing this? And actually trying to embed within that the methodological. And I guess one of the other things, just from my perspective, that is critical is we do have the Cape Town Open Education Declaration. We talk about open education resources, but we're finding that there are very few properly licensed open education resources, because within South Africa, we have, obviously it's a UNESCO definition, which I think most people have hopefully have engaged with. But it's also one of the things I did find was I did do a Creative Commons course on how to understand the licenses, what they mean, what are OER, what are not OER, what are open access, what are free culture works, and so on and so forth. I mean, copyright is a complex set of the law. And yes, it's like, what has this got to do with creativity? Well, what it says is that if you release things so that people can take them and adapt them and use them, and they're not scared of copyright and they're free to use and they're for non-profit purposes, then you enable people to grapple with, to get on board the content, to have the confidence to model and to play. We do know that within South Africa, we have an outdated Copyright Act, and that this needs to be changed, in particular around the concept of fair use. And, I think from a public funds for public goods, taxpayer-funded educational resources should be open. And that's one of the key things that I've been looking at in terms of, your 18A certificates, because we're finding that a lot of stuff is behind a paywall or a registration wall. I did an analysis of JET's analysis of what was available, and almost all of them were copyright, because in South Africa, because of a Berne Convention, if you do not actually actively note them as open access, then or open educate, or if you don't actively license them, they default copyright. And there's a big schism I found between your tertiaries, your universities, which are fully on board, and then your basic education sector, particularly in primary and secondary education, where there are a whole lot of other systemic things happening. And that means that it felt like we were speaking different languages, that what's happening in higher education is you're not having the same conversations necessarily in lower education. And I think, as I said, for me, it's a fundamental part of I know it's not necessarily creativity per se, but I think it's part of that whole system of how do we unlock the system, that I think is really important. And I think that's where I am right now. Yes. Oh, and one final thing I did want to say to Prof. Paul, if he is here, what was interesting is within the first industrial revolution, I did my master's in comparative literature looking at women reading and writing, which was an almost, you can either see it as it came out of nowhere, we could say it was an almost inevitable consequence of a leisured reading bourgeoisie. But the fascinating thing was our modern education curriculum was created by people who were terrified by women reading and writing romances, and felt that they would be sort of abandon themselves to pleasure and lascivious thoughts. And therefore, your modern education curriculum was originally devised as a curriculum for women and shortly became a general curriculum, because at those days, your universities basically studied Latin, Greek, and maths. There wasn't the sense of geography, science, a bit of this, a bit of that. So that in itself is one way in which the education system is very much, or the modern education system is very much a consequence of the first industrial revolution.
Okay. Thank you very much, Katherine. That was a lot of information to take in.
Sorry.
Quite rich. Yes, I think that you're picking up on some of the themes that have been discussed, and in a way you've kind of made a nice closure for this discussion forum by picking up on those and commenting on them. So what struck me was how you started, that humans break things, and we've got this very big problem of vast amounts of waste. We have destruction not only of nature, but of indigenous knowledge systems. And I think that is a very good reason for education. It's one of the things we must retain. Well, I don't know if it's in the classroom yet. I don't know how much is in the classroom, but I know there is some of it that kind of puts that into perspective and makes children aware that they must save and recycle and reuse and that sort of thing. But there's much, much more that can be done. Ian Mole.
Well, just to say, I'm fascinated by that insight into the origins of systematic education in the first industrial revolution related to the education of women. So I want to try and just follow that up with you. Thank you. I've tracked some of it back to Robert Owen's socialist schools in Manchester and in the north of England in that period. But yeah, very interesting. So I'm going to contact you.
I actually just
I'd love
found
to
it now.
read your thesis, for example. Yeah.
Yes, here it is. So
Right.
yeah,
Well,
so it was a
pop it
historiography.
through the ether to me at the moment.
I would have to probably scan it in because unfortunately it was done a
Okay, I
while
think
ago.
you could just
But
hand it across the screen to me, but that's not possible.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Katherine.
Thank you for that. That was really insightful. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Sharon Jeet.
I'm afraid all my work is more as a teacher in schools and that, and therefore it concerns, even though I'm the CEO, but I've got 38 trainers in schools. I am absolutely fascinated by cooperation and collaboration idea that you have proposed. If only that could be taken to classroom, and if only kids could be taught, I don't know how, and I do know how. I'm teaching my own granddaughter, but as someone who comes from England, the amount of racist attacks, sexist language, bullying language, it's enough to make you want to give up. Yeah. And every other day to hear a child has hanged himself or herself, a child has died, a child has fallen down the bloody toilets and died. It's truly, it's enough. What is it in human beings, in your view, that even if they don't understand cooperation and collaboration, I have another word. I understand respect has to be earned, but surely consideration of each other is a possibility. Just consideration on a daily basis. Thank you. Thank you, Katherine. I loved it. Thank you.
I think, the one thing I did find really interesting, and it was something that our German teachers from the Deutsche Schule had insisted on, was how fundamental the collaborative and the cooperative learning techniques were. What we have found is gamifying it, creating. So one of the fundamental things you have to do is create heterogeneous groups. So you can't have friends being together. So that would mean that you would line them up, and then you'd say a heart, for instance, and then you say, okay, one here, one here, one here. And obviously, so there are a number of different techniques you can do, because unless you create a heterogeneous group, where you've got people who are, you know, men and young men and young women together, for instance, you're not going to cross those divides. So that was the one important thing. And then another one is that everybody like sinks or swims together. So the roles are really important, that the task cannot be completed unless each person has a very specific designated role with associated goals. So they are codependent and the group needs them. So there were a lot of those really important techniques that then help to break down those barriers. And then, you know, it's icebreakers, it's spending time on creating a group identity, learning something interesting about the other person, but obviously you steer clear of anything that's too deep or you know, like what was the worst day of your life, for instance, is not a question you ask. You might ask something like, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite animal? And so on. And then you initially set little tasks just to create that social cohesion within the group, that you've got a group identity. And all of those techniques are just so powerful in enabling people to see people as people. And as I said, if we look at Google, we look at the research, that your teams that flourish and thrive are where they have that sense of psychological safety, that they know that people see them and that they are valued. And unless you've got that as your basis, forget creativity. Content is not going to, you might get content, but you're not going to get creativity. And one of the interesting things, I had a woman from Japan, and she came to some initial things. Now, Japan is extremely good at content, but not creativity. And she modeled how they worked. And what would happen was you'd say, okay, there's 4 hypotheses, and then you'd have to agree to one of them. And then you'd go, no, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. And we were all shattered. We were like, oh no, even when we kind of modeled it saying, okay, well, we know the answer, but we'll be group A, even though we know B is the right answer, we were actually quite shattered as adults. And we were kind of like, well, if this is what it takes for Japan to succeed, like, and she said, people do really well in Japan, but they hate it. I mean, they hate science. And we see incremental change and not step change, which is your creativity, your flowering, your diversity. And as I said, we know that we have such big and complex problems that unless we actually look and take on board everything, how can we even begin to think we can solve it? You know, the context, the people, you know. I mean, my favorite example is this NGO in I think India that drilled wells, and then because they were saying, oh, why do you catch the monsoon rain in a mud dam? And then they discovered the wells were full of cyanide, and now they've had to go and reteach people how to build mud dams.
Oh my God! I lived in a mud hut when I was a child.
Yeah. But yes, so I think so we have found that the cooperative learning techniques are very profound, but we also know that there's enormous pushback, especially from headmasters and headmistresses who say the children are not being quiet, the children are, you know, they're not sitting on their hands with these, but again, you know, that how do you enable hands-on and hands-on without that?
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Katherine and Sharon Jeet, for engaging.